president of the Friends of the Henderson Libraries, and we are thrilled tonight to have with us Mr. William Krueger, very famous author, and his lovely wife Diane. They came from Minnesota, from Minneapolis, to spend the weekend with us, and we're thrilled. I have read every book he's written, I swear. And as much as I love Cork O'Connor, I get angry with him, but I think my favorite is The Devil's Bed. I think that's phenomenal, but they're all wonderful, and we're anxiously awaiting for the next book or two. And I want to thank Lisa Phelan. She's our manager of reference here at the Salisbury Library. She's going to be interviewing Kent, and after it's over, he will graciously be signing your book. So thank you all for coming. And I'm going to turn it over to them.
Thank you so much, Marion. We just had a little powwow, and I think we're concerned that the folks in the back can't see us. So I'm okay with standing, Kent. How about you?
I would prefer that if you actually came to see us, you could see us.
Yes. How's this?
Is this good? Yeah. Can you stand for an hour?
I can stand longer.
Can you stand me for an hour?
First of all, it is such a delight to have you here. We are really, truly honored to have you here. Thank you so much, and thank you, Diane, for coming out to Las Vegas and Henderson. And I understand this is your first trip here. Is that true?
Well, to Henderson, but I've lost a lot of money in Las Vegas.
Okay.
Yeah, we were here about a year and a half ago. My daughter and my grandson and Diane and I came to Las Vegas so we could go up to the Grand Canyon and raft to the Colorado River. Oh my God, was that fun!
That's wonderful. Well, great. I want to give a shout out to your fan club. They call themselves your stalkers. But we have Marion, Judy, and Chloe, who were really instrumental in bringing you here. So we want to thank you. Yes, ladies.
Yeah.
They've known you for a long time.
The truth of that story, Lisa, is they got me drunk.
That's how we got in here.
Well, regardless, we're glad that you're here. Okay, so we're going to begin asking some questions, and so this is how the evening's going to go. We're going to do some questions up here, and then we'll open up to the audience for a couple questions, and then we're going to do a book signing, and I believe the book signing we're going to line up here, and Kent is just going to stay right here. We're going to move the table up so he can sign your book, and then everyone will kind of exit out that way, and that's what we'll do. And I've got some timekeepers. Dana and Marcy are going to keep me on track, so, okay, thanks. Okay, Kent, you are best known for your popular New York Times best-selling Cork O'Connor mystery series. Can you tell us a little bit about Cork O'Connor, your protagonist, and as your main character through 15 books, what do you like most about him?
Okay, Cork. Yeah, I've lived with this guy for a very, very long time. So here's the evolution of Cork O'Connor. Long before I had in my head any kind of an idea for a plot, I had in mind a guy. And initially all I knew about this guy that I wanted to write about was that he was going to be the kind of guy who was so resilient that no matter how far life pushed him down, he would always bob back to the surface, and his name would be Cork. I told that to an audience not long ago, and a guy raised his hand and said, "Why didn't you call him Bob?" So that was the beginning of Cork. And then when I realized I was going to set my work in the great north woods of Minnesota, the North Country, and took a really good look at the North Country of Minnesota, I realized you can't write a true story about that part of Minnesota without including the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, as an element of the story, because their influence up there is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's powerful. So I knew I was going to include the Ojibwe as a part of my stories. And when you're a writer of fiction, anybody here who's a writer, you know this. What you're looking for is conflict, because it's conflict that drives great stories. Romeo and Juliet, what is it that drives that story? It's the conflict between the Montagues and the Capulets, in which our star-crossed lovers find themselves caught. Moby Dick, Ahab and that white whale, it's conflict. So when I looked up north and saw an area that was nothing but conflict, the whites and the Ojibwe trying to live together and not always doing a very good job of it. Well, actually, the Finns and the Swedes, you name it. And the landscape up there, that rugged landscape, just cried out conflict. And those of you who know anything about Minnesota, you know our weather. And you could write tomes about our weather, and I do actually. So when I thought more deeply about the whole idea of conflict, I thought, what if I created a character who he was would mirror the conflict of those two cultures, white and Ojibwe. So I knew Cork was going to be a man of mixed heritage. So I knew he was going to be Ojibwe, and then the question was, what was that white heritage going to be? And in Minnesota, you could be Ojibwe Finn, Ojibwe Swede, Ojibwe German, Ojibwe Dutch, Ojibwe Italian, you name it. For a variety of reasons, Cork became Irish. He was going to be Ojibwe Irish, and Cork very naturally became Corcoran O'Connor. Cork, in the beginning at any rate, was a lot like me. Cork is a family man. I'm a family man. Cork has children. I have children. Cork's married to a blonde attorney. I'm married to a blonde attorney. That said, from the get-go, were many things that were different about Cork than me. O'Connor is an Irish name. Krueger is not Irish. Cork is Catholic. I'm Methodist. Cork has significant Ojibwe heritage, native heritage in his lineage. I have none. Cork has a deep law enforcement background. I spent a night in jail once. So there's a lot about Cork that doesn't have anything to do with me. So he's this amalgam of the things that I know and those areas that I have explored and been happy to explore. So that's Cork O'Connor.
Thank you. Now, your stories are mostly set in Minnesota, but you're originally not from there. Can you share with us a little bit about your upbringing and what brought you to Minnesota?
Sure. Okay, so I was born in Wyoming. We moved to Oklahoma. Then we moved to Texas. Then we moved to Ohio. 3 times in Ohio. Then we moved to Oregon. Then we moved to California. Then we moved to Colorado. Then I met Diane. I married her. I moved to Nebraska. Then I went back to Colorado. And that was, by then I was 10 years old. After Diane and I had been married for several years, we were ready for a change. We had our daughter, and we didn't want to live in Denver anymore for a variety of reasons. So my wonderful wife took the LSAT, which is, for those of you who don't know, that's what you take if you want to become a lawyer. And depending upon how well you do on the LSAT, you kind of pick schools in large measure based on that. So Diane aced the LSATs. We could have gone anywhere in the country. So we sat down with a map, and we looked over all of the places that she could have gone to law school, and we narrowed it down to 2 choices. Either Missoula, Montana. If you've been to Missoula, you know why. and the Twin Cities, for many, many reasons. We decided on the Twin Cities, and it was a choice I have always been so happy we made, because I was a gypsy kid when I grew up. I never really had anywhere that I called or thought of as home. But swear to God, the minute I set foot in Minnesota, I knew I'd found home. For whatever reason, I fell absolutely in love with that place. And it's Minnesota that really has given me the inspiration to do so much of my work. I've tried to write about the other places I lived. It just hasn't worked. For whatever reason, Minnesota inspires me. Just gets down into my soul, what can I say?
So moving as much as you did get to Stanford University on a full scholarship. So was academics important to you in your home?
Oh, yeah, my father was a high school English teacher. So you better believe I did my homework. But I really liked school. I liked it a lot. And one of the things that happens to a kid who moves around a lot is that you learn very quickly how to become a part of a community. So the first thing we did whenever we moved to a new town was we would join a church. So I began to know people of the church, and then I was kind of an athletic kid growing up, so we would go out to the ball field and play football or baseball, whatever, get to know the local kids, and then get involved in the school. And so the school was, for me, an important social environment. So I did well. And because my father was a teacher, it was important that I do well. We were broke. Any of you who have been teachers or grew up with teachers, you know they don't pay teachers. They don't pay teachers or librarians nearly enough. So I always knew that when I went to, yeah, big hand for the librarians, folks, and the teachers. So I knew that going to school was going to be all on my shoulders, and I worked very hard, and I was fortunate to get a full ride to Stanford.
Reading your books.
No, aren't you going to ask me why I got kicked out of Stanford?
Do you want to tell that story?
It's such a good part of the story. Why did I
know. Yes, so you spent 1 year at Stanford. Can you tell us about, you were there at an interesting time in our history. Would you like to share that with us?
Sure, it was. I entered Stanford in the fall of 1969 at the height of the Vietnam War, which all of us who lived through that knows how terribly divided we were as a nation as a result of that conflict. In the spring of 1970, I don't know how much you recall of this, but the spring of 1970 was the spring of the shootings on the Kent State campus. There were also shootings in North Carolina. In spring, we learned that the United States had been, for a very long time, carrying out a secret war, bombing in Cambodia, something that they had denied forever, but finally admitted to. So, and the nation was just in upheaval. Stanford University at that point in time had a relationship with an organization that was called the Stanford Research Institute. And this was an organization who, at that point, whose primary source of income was research for military weaponry. And there were a lot of us at Stanford that felt that that was an inappropriate relationship for an institution like Stanford, particularly at that moment in time, to maintain. So we petitioned the administration to sever the ties. We petitioned the trustees to sever the ties. We marched. We protested. But there was so much money involved that we were unheard. So finally, one day a bunch of us marched into the administration building and took it over. We occupied the administration building. The president at that point was a guy named Richard Lyman, and he was a pretty reasonable guy. He said, "I'm not going to give you any problems," and he vacated the building, told all of the employees to leave for the day, so we occupied the administration building. That evening, a band came in, and in that area where typically we would have registered for classes, we held a dance. About midnight, the band packed up and headed out. Those of us who were going to occupy the building rolled out our sleeping bags. And at 1 o'clock, when we were all asleep, the Palo Alto riot squad swept through and arrested us. My scholarship evaporated. You know, it was their right. And so I had to leave Stanford. But I have to tell you this, when I explained the situation to my folks, they were so supportive of me that I was really happy to see that. But the other thing is this. I've always found it was a whole lot more interesting to say that I was kicked out of Stanford than that I graduated from the place. You know, much more interesting story.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, a couple questions from your fans here. They wanted to know, and we're going back to the Krueger Connor books, they wanted to know about Henry, the Medicine Man, the spiritual guide. Does he ever age?
Well, yeah. When I began the series, he was like 90-ish. And he aged rather slowly. He has aged rather slowly across the... For those of you who don't know what we're talking about, Henry Malou is one of the recurring characters in my Cork O'Connor series. He's about as close as I come to writing a stock character, the wise old medicine man. Malou, he's a Mide, a member of the Grand Medicine Society in the Ojibwe community. He's a healer, and he's Cork's mentor. And he's the guy Cork turns to whenever he can't quite unravel a mystery or his life is all knotted up. And one of the things I like about Henry Malou is he never gives Cork a straight answer. He typically will present Cork with a riddle, and once Cork has solved the riddle, he understands the wisdom Malou is offering him. I know he walks perilously close to being stock, and so I've worked quite hard to make him a believable character. Sure, he is wise and compassionate and brave and funny, but he farts a lot, as old people do, me among them. In the last book I wrote, I think either Wendigo Island or Manitou Canyon, he admits to believing he's actually 100 years old. Yeah. So,
He's still hanging in there.
It's fiction. I can make him live as long as I want him to live. So for those of you who appreciate Henry Malou as a character, he's my favorite character to write. He's the favorite character of a lot of folks who read my work. I have promised that the last book in the series will be the book in which Henry Malou takes to the path of souls. Because I can't imagine writing a story without Henry's energy somehow at the heart of it. But I promise you, I will give him a great death.
And here is another fan question in quotes. All his books are cold. Why always the cold? Do cold characters make for better stories?
Well, actually, not all my books are cold. I try as much as I can to vary the season in which a story is set. Because one of the things I love about Minnesota is it's a territory of 4 distinct seasons. A really profound, beautiful, stunningly beautiful fall. A winter that is legendary and has so much, in lots of good ways, too. A spring that lasts a day. And summer. And so I've done my best to vary the stories so that each of the seasons is highlighted. Because weather isn't just part of the background, I don't think, should just be a part of the background of the story. Weather is a character. Weather helps inform the story. Weather helps create the atmosphere for a story. Sometimes the motivation rises out of the weather itself. So I try to give each of the seasons their fair share of time. But writing cold is great. Because the truth is, I write suspense, I write mysteries, I write things in which people are in jeopardy and in fact die. And the truth about Minnesota in winter is if you're not careful, the winter will kill you. It really will. So I can use that coldness to great effect.
Yes, and us in the Southwest, we're just, freezing during reading your stories.
Okay. You're freezing when it's 60 degrees outside. You guys are such wusses.
That's true. So you wrote Iron Lake in your 40s, and what were you doing up till that time, and how did the decision to really go for it, to decide to become a writer come about?
Well, I've always been a writer, because I've always been a reader. Probably like a lot of you, I was blessed with parents who read to me when I was a kid. When I was a child, I never went down for a nap. I never went to bed at night without a story being read to me. So I grew up thinking of the world in terms of stories. And for whatever reason, I always wanted to be one of the storytellers. Okay, so the first story I ever wrote, remember writing, was a short story in the 3rd grade. It was called The Walking Dictionary. Now, I told you my father was a high school English teacher. Any high school English teachers here this evening? Oh, God bless you, God bless you. Well, I don't know about you guys, but my father was always storming around the house ranting something like, nobody uses dictionaries enough. Nobody uses dictionaries enough. So in the 3rd grade, I wrote a short story called The Walking Dictionary, which was, in fact, about a dictionary that didn't think it was being used enough. It magically sprouted legs so that it could toddle off into the world and go to the people that needed it. My 3rd grade teacher oohed and awed over that story. My folks oohed and awed over that story. So in the third grade, swear to God, third grade, I knew I was going to be a writer. So I have always written. But over all of the early years of my writing, I really didn't produce anything that I was particularly pleased with for a variety of reasons I won't go into at this point. After I left Stanford, I never really went back to school, seriously, because I didn't think college was teaching me what I needed to know in order to be a writer. So I went on to experience the world sort of the Hemingway education track. So I logged timber, and I worked construction, and I mopped hospital floors, and when Diane went to law school, I went to work as a bureaucrat at the University of Minnesota for a while. Then I stepped away from that. I got a fantastic writer's grant when I was about 40 years old that allowed me to step away from my job for about a year and a half and do nothing but write. But I had to go back to work after that. So what I was doing just before I sold my Cork O'Connor series and was able to step away from the workaday world was this. I was for 9 years a professional collector of baby spit. I kid you not. Yeah, they paid me to collect baby spit. Okay, so here's the true story. I ran a research laboratory at the University of Minnesota at the Institute of Child Development there, so we studied children. And the professor for whom I ran this laboratory, her area of interest was stress. How, as human beings, do we develop the mechanisms that help us deal with the everyday stressors of life? So we were looking at children who were undergoing typical stressful situations. Kids who were going from home care into kindergarten. Can be a very chaotic, stressful transition for kids. 2, 4, 6 month inoculations, we looked at those. Circumcision, we looked at that. Don't let anybody tell you it doesn't hurt. When you're looking for stress, indicators of stress, you look for a hormone called cortisol. We know it's always in our bodies, but we know it's there in larger amounts if we've undergone a stressful situation. So theoretically speaking, if you know the level of cortisol in a child before a stressful event, and you know the level following it, you get what's called a gauge of reactivity. How stressful was it for the child? To get at the cortisol, you take a saliva sample because you can assay the saliva for the amount of cortisol in it. So seriously, a lot of my job was to come up with creative ways to get kids to spit at me, which is not as easy as you might think. I loved working for the Institute. I loved the research we did. I thought it was important stuff, but I wanted to write. So as soon as I sold my first books, I jumped ship.
Now, Ordinary Grace is a departure from your Cork O'Connor series. You describe it as a story told from the heart, the best story you've ever written. How did this story about a family set in 1961 Minnesota come to you?
Sure. I hate to ask this, but how many of you have not read Ordinary Grace? Have not read Ordinary Grace. Okay, I see a lot of hands out there. Get out. No, this is for those of you who raised your hand. Ordinary Grace is very different from my Cork O'Connor series. It's really at heart a very simple story. It takes place in the summer of 1961. It's the story, it's set in a small town deep in the very beautiful Minnesota River Valley. It's the story of a Methodist minister whose beloved child is murdered. That's the compelling mystery component. But at heart, it's really the story of what that terrible tragedy does to this man's faith, his family, and ultimately the entire fabric of the small town in which he lives. So, this is going to take a moment to answer this question. Ordinary Grace was a very risky proposition for me. For this reason, my publisher called me out to New York City many, many years ago and sat me down and said, "Kent, we only want Cork O'Connor novels from you." And I won't go into why they did that. But when this idea for a story that was not a Cork O'Connor story came to me, I knew that if I, in fact, wrote it, it was going to be at great risk, because clearly my publisher wasn't interested in it. I had no idea if anybody else would want to buy it. But in the end, I didn't have a choice. It was a story that spoke to me on such a deep and compelling level that I had to write it. I wrote it for a couple of reasons. The first was this: I had been looking for a story for a while that would allow me to go back and recall an important period in my own life. The summer I was 13 years old. I don't know what being 13 years old is like for the women here, but for guys, it's an important period in our lives. We're standing, in that threshold. We got one foot poised in our childhood, still firmly planted there, and one foot poised to take us into our manhood, but we're not ready to go there yet. For a lot of reasons, across the whole course of my life, I have vividly remembered the summer I was 13 years old. So I wanted to go back and find a story that would allow me to go back and recall it and evoke it in such a way that I could use part of my own life, bits and pieces of my own experience, to write the story. So for those of you who have read Ordinary Grace, the Drum family, that's my family. The town of New Bremen, that is so the Midwest towns that I grew up in my adolescence. The quarry, you remember the scene where the kids swim in the quarry? I swam in that quarry. The pharmacy where the kids sip root beer, I sipped Richardson's root beer in that pharmacy. The place where the barbershop where they get their haircut, that's where I got my haircut every 6 weeks or so. So I wanted to be able to use things I remembered, my own experience, my own perceptions to create the story. And I wanted to be able to write it in such a way that even readers who were born decades later could read that book and know what it was like to be a 13-year-old boy in a small Midwestern town in the summer of 1961. So that was one motivation. But we're cool? Okay. So the other thing was this. If you're familiar at all with the Cork O'Connor series, you know that very often in the stories I write, there is a... Is that me?
Do you want to take this?
Let's
Switch.
Let me use this.
Yeah.
Are we still on? Yeah. Let me use this for a minute and see what happens.
Okay.
This is scientific experimentation here. You remove one variable. So, if you're familiar with my series, you may be aware that very often in the stories there's an undercurrent that deals with the spiritual journey. It's something that comes very naturally for Cork O'Connor because he's a guy with a foot in two different spiritual traditions. His white Catholicism, he's Irish Catholic, and his Ojibwe spirituality. And very often in the stories he's trying to figure out where his true spiritual path lies. And that's been an issue for me my whole life. So I wanted to write a story that would allow me to explore more deeply the whole question of the importance of the divine, of the spiritual journey that I think we're all on. And Ordinary Grace, when that story coalesced for me, I knew was the perfect vehicle for that.
So, and I'll try this, we'll see how we do here. I wanted to see too if Ordinary Grace brought you new readership, and I can just only want to share my own story about how Ordinary Grace came into my life, because Patricia Weisner, who runs our very popular mystery book club, many of you are here from that, had picked this book called Ordinary Grace. And I looked at it, the title caught me, and it's just like, that doesn't sound like a mystery. And some of the volunteers were coming into their office and they were talking about how much they liked this book. And I was really drawn to it. I was drawn to the title. I was drawn to some of the comments that I was hearing from our readers. And so I picked up the book, and I want you to know, I called my mom and I read to her the prologue, because my mom brought to me a love of reading, and I wanted to share that with her. And she, in turn, she told me later after she read the book that she read one of the sermons to my father, who is dealing with cancer right now. So it just really has touched me so deeply, and I hope that if you haven't had a chance to read Ordinary Grace, that you do, because it is wonderful. It's one of my favorite books.
Thank you. It's a very special book for me.
And has it brought new readership? It won the Edgar Award, it won awards left and right. How do you feel about that? And, you know, as apart from what your publisher told you, that he didn't want this book.
Actually, it was a she. You sexist person. So when I finished the manuscript for Ordinary Grace, even though my publisher had told me they didn't really want anything like that, I went ahead and sent it to my editor in New York City. My publisher is Simon & Schuster, large publishing house. I sent it to my editor in New York City, a wonderful woman named Sarah Branham. About 3 weeks after I sent her that manuscript, I got an email from her that went something like this. Dear Kent, I've been reading the manuscript for Ordinary Grace on the subway on my way to work every morning, and I've been reading it on the subway on my way home every night, and I've decided I can't do that anymore because people on the subway don't understand why I'm crying. She said, I love this story, of course we'll publish it. And they ended up getting behind Ordinary Grace in a way they've never been behind any individual Krueger novel. I was very pleased to see that. And I was very pleased with the reception that it's had. At this point, Ordinary Grace is on track, at some point, if it continues this way, to outsell my entire Krueger run. So here's an interesting, so clearly it has opened up a much broader readership to me than those who might simply read mysteries. And here's something that has come from all of this that I love talking to other writers about, but I'm going to tell you guys about it too. So when my publisher saw how well Ordinary Grace was doing, they were eager for a follow-up novel. So I signed a contract for a follow-up novel to Ordinary Grace. They paid me a shitload of money for it. And I spent the next 2 years writing what I hoped would be the companion novel to Ordinary Grace. That manuscript was due to my publisher over a year ago last August. 2 months before that deadline, I set up a meeting in Chicago with my agent to talk about revisions to the manuscript because there were problems with it. She knew it, I knew it. 2 days before I met with her, I sent her an email saying basically, when we get together, I don't want to talk about revisions to this piece. I want to talk about how we keep it from being published. Because it wasn't the story I'd imagined it would be. I had no idea how to make it that story, and frankly, at that point, I wasn't interested in it. I have a great agent. She was very supportive, and as it turns out, I had a very understanding publisher as well, so we renegotiated things. But here is the lesson that I took from this. I believe that if you're a writer, and I don't care whether you're writing in a genre, you're a mystery writer, think of yourself as a mystery writer, or a romance writer, or a science fiction writer, or you think of yourself as a literary writer. I think we all need to consider ourselves artists, and words are our medium. And if we're true to this, what that means is that we're always going to be trying to grow. We ought to always be trying to push our limits. And if we're true to that, what it means is that very often we're going to be out there walking a dangerous edge. And if we do that, what it means is that we're going to be risking a fall. I fell. Then the question I had to ask myself was, did I fail? And I got to tell you honestly, I've never thought of this experience as a failure. For me, it's simply been another place that I visited in this journey that I'm on as a writer. But here's another interesting aspect of this. When I let go of all the weighty expectations for that piece, when I got it off my shoulders and felt freed, it was like the sky opened up above me, and I saw very clearly the story I should have been writing. And about 10 months ago, I began working on what I believe will be the true companion companion novel to Ordinary Grace. It's a manuscript that will be called This Tender Land, and it's good. It's really good.
Okay, we just have, I have many more questions, but we only have...
I know I talk a lot.
It's been wonderful. It's been wonderful. Okay, where do I go? Okay, well, I just want to talk a little bit about social media and the impact that it's had maybe with the relationship with your readers. Do you Skype with book clubs? And how can your fans and readers connect with you on social media?
Sure, I do Skype. I Skype very often with book clubs because it's a whole lot easier than making a long trip to the book club itself. Seriously, I get so many requests to do book club that let's try that.
Let's try that.
Let's both use this one. That I simply can't accommodate them, but I can Skype. I can Skype in my jammies if I wanted to. So it's with a glass of wine, which I typically do. Not the jammy part, the glass of wine part. So yeah, I enjoy immensely visiting with book clubs, and so that's important because it helps to spread the word. And the other thing that it does is that it lets readers know me, and I think that's important. I think the more I don't know, I know lots of authors in the writing field now. What other field would authors be working in? I don't know. I know lots of authors now, and the more I know about them, the more I know the stories, the more I understand who they are, the more I actually appreciate their work. And so I think that's important. Yeah, in this day and age, you have to, of social media, you have to be involved in social media. So I have a website, an active website, I have an author Facebook page, my blog sometimes. I don't tweet. I have a Twitter account that I actually pay someone to tweet and retweet for me. And that's where I draw the line. To say I tweeted, there's something not right about it. Excuse me, I tweeted. So absolutely, when the first cold splash of reality that hits your face when you publish a novel is the realization that your publisher is probably going to do very little to help you get that book into readers' hands. It's mostly on your own shoulders. And so you do an enormous amount of work promoting whatever you've written. You visit libraries and bookstores and book clubs and you create those websites and you do all of this stuff because you never know of all that you do what's going to have an impact. And probably the truth is that everything contributes to that. So if you're going to be successful in this business, you have to buy into social media. You really do.
Okay, I have one more question. I'm just going back and forth, which I asked, but I have to say that you wrote a blog article called Librarians Rock. And can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with libraries and librarians, and were libraries part of your upbringing? Were they important to you?
I got a great story about libraries that I love telling. So, I think it's me. Damn it. So when I was the summer I was 12 years old, I was a Boy Scout, and that was the summer I decided I was going to get my reading merit badge. One of the requirements for the reading merit badge, at least back then, was that you had to spend some time volunteering at your local library. I was living in a little town in Ohio at that point, so I went to the librarian and I made the arrangements, and when the time came, I showed up to do my duty. Now this was long before they had computerized check-in and check-out. You guys remember that little envelope thing that they used to put at the back of the cover of every book? Yeah. So what they did was they put me to work date stamping the returned books. So they gave me this little black ink pad and a little changeable rubber date stamp. And so for the first hours, that was sort of ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. And after about an hour of that, the librarian proceeded to walk my way and ask me that question that, because I was afraid she was going to ask me, I pretty much knew she would. She said to me, "Kent, what do you like to read?" The honest to God truth was I like to read comic books. But I didn't want to tell her that. So I very briefly considered lying to her, but there was that whole a scout is trustworthy thing going on. So I told her the truth, and without batting an eye, she said to me, "Have you ever read The Count of Monte Cristo?" So I walked out of the library that day with that great Dumont classic under my arm, and I came back several days later and checked out The Three Musketeers, and after that it was The Man in the Iron Mask. And when I'd read everything that our little library had by Dumont, I asked her, what should I read next? And she turned me on to H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and Arthur Conan Doyle and Jack London and Robert Louis Stevenson and all these guys who wrote these great stories that were perfect for capturing a boy's heart and a boy's imagination. So I don't know how you think of librarians. I don't think of them as just those people who keep the books on the shelves in the right order and maybe give us a hard time when we return them late. I think of librarians as important guides in our understanding of the world, particularly when we're young. And you consider the books, the reading, the stories that they guide us to. I think of libraries as the archives of our culture, and our librarians are the archivists. These are the people who take care of the books, those important books that tell us who we were, where we came from, maybe help us understand who we are now, and maybe even point the direction to where we're going, who we might become. When libraries are gone, and our librarians with them, there goes everything we are as a people. There goes our whole culture. So join me right now in giving our librarians a big hand. Yeah, I think librarians are the cornerstone of our democracy. They help educate our people. They help inform our people. They ought to help us make judicious choices in how we behave toward one another, toward other people in the world, all of that. So yeah, they're very important.
That's a wonderful note to end this portion of our Q&A. Let's please give Kent a big round of applause. We have a couple minutes for some questions in the audience, and I think what I'm going to do is we're going to switch. And I can bring my mic to anybody who has a question. Okay, we'll do.
Thank you for coming. My name is Spiro Alexio, and I work as a psychotherapist here in Las Vegas, and I also work as a writer. Mostly I write about mental health and psychology, but I started as a short story writer, so my stuff is more interesting than most of the people who write in my field. I wanted,
Good for you.
Yeah, I can do funny too, which most people can't. But here's my situation. I've been in extended writing funk. Haven't written anything for over a year. Haven't gotten anything published for a year and a half, 2 years. So could you please talk about your writing routine, any rituals you use, and how you've gotten out of any slump? You're so prolific. I don't know if you can identify with that, but I'd like to hear a little bit about that, please.
Sure, Spiro, and the way I go about my work is designed, I hope, to prevent me from falling into that dark place where you are at the moment. And it's very real, and I have so many friends who have been where you are. And so I can give you hope. There is a place out of it. This is what I do, and when anybody asks me, what should I do as a writer? What do you believe I should do? I'm going to tell you to do this because it's all I know. I write every day. My alarm goes off at 6:15 every morning, and I get up, I get myself dressed, and I go to a coffee shop. And the first 2 hours of every day I spend writing. I have done that for more than 30 years now. When I began that process, there was a very practical reason for it. My wife Diane had just entered law school, and I suddenly became the sole support of the family. I was the guy who had to keep a roof overhead and food on the table. And I knew if I was going to meet those responsibilities and still develop as a writer, I had to find a way to do that. And actually, it was Hemingway who showed me the way. One of the things I knew about, he's a big hero of mine, one of the things I knew about Hemingway was that he loved nothing better than to rise at first light and spend the first 2 hours of every day writing. He felt it was the most creative time of the day. We were living at that point 2 blocks from this iconic cafe in St. Paul called the St. Clair Broiler, who opened their doors at 6 o'clock in the morning. So I told Diane, honey, if you're wanting to get the kids up and get them ready and get them off to school so that I can go write first thing in the morning, I swear to you, when I come home at the end of the day from my job, I will be the best husband, the best father you can possibly imagine. She bought it. So there I was at the broiler every morning at 6 o'clock with my notebook and pen in hand. This was long before we had laptops. They would open the doors. I would go inside, sit down in booth number 4. It was always booth number 4. They actually saved it for me. They poured me my coffee. I opened my notebook, and from 6 to 7:15 I wrote every day. 7:15 I closed my notebook, paid for my coffee, and went out front because a bus would pick me up at 7:20 that would take me to the U where I was working. That did 2 things for me as a writer. The first thing it did was help me establish the discipline that I think is absolutely necessary to an artist, and I don't care what your medium is. If you're going to accomplish anything, I think you have to approach it in a disciplined way. So it helped me establish the discipline of writing, but it did something else for me that I didn't realize until I looked back on that period. And when I looked back, this was what I realized. If I wrote first thing every morning, I was feeding something in me that needed to be fed. And that gave me the energy to go out into the world and give to it whatever I had to give to it to keep a roof overhead and food on the table, because I'd taken care of something that was important to me, something elemental to who I was. What I realized was that writing had become the way I centered myself in every day, and that's still one of the most important functions my writing does for me. So my first recommendation is make sure you carve out some time in every single day to write. And it doesn't matter what you write. I think if you stay connected with the energy of the process itself, eventually the story that's waiting to present itself to you will be there, and you'll be ready to write it. That's my advice.
Thank you. Any other questions? Martha?
I don't need mine.
Oh.
I don't talk, so I don't need mine. Have you ever met the other famous Minnesota writer, John Stanford?
Yeah, I know John Stanford.
And do you
Yep.
all communicate at all?
Do you know, John and I have shared a dais on a number of occasions, but Sanford's up here. I'm not up here. So I run into John periodically. We admire one another's work, but we don't really hobnob together. But Stanford is one of the few in Minnesota is so full of marvelous writers. Not just mystery writers, but writers in general. But we have some great mystery writers out there. And we all know each other. And we all get together periodically and drink a bunch and talk business and all of that. So John's typically not a part of that. He's kind of exists in the ethers.
Thank you. Martha?
My mother also read to me every night as
Yeah.
a child. I am hooked on audiobooks.
Yeah.
And I listened to your book on audio, and it was a wonderful production. Do you have anything to do with the production of the audiobook?
Yeah. No. It's a good question, and no, I don't. And I wish I did, because a lot of the pronunciations of the readers are incorrect, and it bugs people in Minnesota who know how things are pronounced correctly. I sought to rectify that by offering my services. I wanted to read my own stuff. We had just moved my work to a different audio company. I've been with 3 different audio book companies now, and when we went to the second company, Brilliance, I told them, I think I'd like to try to read my own stuff. And they said, well, sure, come on out. We'll give you an audition. So they were in Grand Haven, Michigan. So Diane and I went out to Grand Haven. They put me in this recording booth, headphones on, opened the book. This was for a novel called Thunder Bay. And opened to the first page of the book, and I began to read. I'm a pretty good reader, and at least in terms of exposition. And Thunder Bay opens with quite a bit of exposition, so I'm going along thinking, boy, I'm doing a good job. So they said, great, Kent, now let's go to some dialogue. So they turned to a place in the book where they had marked a section where a number of different people are talking, men and women, some children are involved, and that's when I began to understand why you use professional readers. Because my men sounded like my women, my children sounded like adults, and so I knew how that audition went. And it's just fine, because, think about it, where do stories come from? It was an oral tradition. Long before we had a written language, we told stories. They were important to us long before we ever wrote them down. It's a natural way to tell a story, and a good reader can enhance a story a great deal in the same way that a bad reader can destroy a story. So I think I've had pretty good readers, generally speaking. I've been happy with the job they've done.
The reader for Ordinary Grace is very good.
Thank you. He was a different reader than I've used. I asked for a different reader than the Cork O'Connor series because I wanted a different voice for that, for people who do listen to my work in audio. Yeah.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Okay. You don't need the mic. Okay.
I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I would like to know who you read when you decide to read a book, or,
That's a good question.
I'd like to know who you are.
Sure, the truth is that 90% of my reading these days is of pieces of writing you won't see for another year. Most of my reading now is done in what's called ARCs, Advanced Readers Copies, or bound galleys. And these are books that I have agreed to read to offer a dust jacket quote for. So when you read on the front of a cover, Lee Child says, "This is the best thing since sliced bread." That doesn't mean Lee read it. So here's a great story in that regard. So I know Lee, he's a good friend, and as I was coming up in the business, I asked Lee to read one of my novels and give it a dust jacket quote. He's a very generous guy. But he said, "Kent, I am so overwhelmed, I simply can't read the book, but I'll give you a great quote." And he did, and my publisher has used it again and again and again for a book Lee never even read. So just a word of warning, take with a grain of salt a dust jacket quote that one writer gives to another, because we all know each other. We're not going to say anything bad about our friends. So most of the work, reading that I do these days are for ARCs. When I do have that rare opportunity to choose my own reading, 9 times out of 10 I'm going to choose a mystery because I love the genre. I think some of the best writing out there you're going to find in the genre. And when I choose an author to read, typically I choose someone who writes like I do, which is someone who writes profoundly out of a sense of place, someone for whom character development is important, someone for whom language, the use of language, is clearly something that they think of as they're creating this story. So I read James Lee Burke, one of my favorite writers. I don't think there's anybody who writes better prose, inside or outside the genre, than James Lee Burke. Dark stories with beautiful, beautiful prose. Dennis Lehane writes wonderful work. Louise Penny, Margaret Cole. So those are several of the authors that I choose to read. I go back to Tony Hellerman. I return to my roots. I write what I do in large measure because of Tony Hellerman. If I'm reading outside the genre, I typically will read Midwest authors because I think a case can be made that there is in fact a Midwest voice in literature. It's a very spare voice, but very eloquent. And it's tied, I believe, to an understanding of our relationship to the land. We shape the land, but the land also shapes us. And so So Marilyn Robinson, Gilead, Lila, Kent Harrah, Plainsong, Eventide, Benediction. There's a great guy at work in our neck of the woods, a guy named Kent Myers you've never heard of. Write down this name, Kent Myers, and check his books out of the library. Fantastic, fantastic writer. So those are some of the ones that I read. Are we at the end?
We are,
Can I make one more comment?
absolutely.
Just want to say one final thing, folks. You know, I've been doing public appearances for almost 20 years now. And at the beginning of my career, I had the same situation occur that happens with every author at the beginning of their career, wherein you set up a signing and it's several hours from your house and you drive all the way there, and the only ones present at that signing are you and the bookseller and the bookseller's cat. So I began a little ritual that I have followed to this day. Just in advance of an event, I say a prayer, and it goes like this. Please, dear Lord, let there be people. Thank you, Lord. Thanks, folks, for coming out today.
Thank you so much for being here. I think you'll all agree this is a really special night.